What if I told you that losing 500 tanks in 48 hours wasn't actually a military failure, but a calculated sacrifice that won a different war entirely? You've probably seen the headlines. A Russian general makes a tactical blunder, armor units get obliterated, and it's spun as incompetence or hubris. But there's a hidden layer to how modern generals actually think, and it has almost nothing to do with the tank count or the immediate battlefield loss. Here's what nobody talks about. In contemporary warfare, especially the kind Russia engages in, there's a concept called force commitment signaling. When a general orders a massive armor push, even knowing it will result in heavy losses, he's not always trying to win that single engagement. He's trying to communicate something to multiple audiences simultaneously. His political leadership at home, the enemy command structure across the front, neutral observers, and most critically, the logistics and intelligence networks that depend on reading the battlefield through casualty patterns. Think about it from an information warfare perspective. If you're a Russian command element in 2024 and your forces are depleted, overstretched, and facing an enemy with superior equipment, you have a problem that more tanks won't solve. What you actually need is to shift the narrative. You need your opponent to believe you still have overwhelming force. You need your domestic audience to see commitment and aggression, not retreat. And you need your own soldiers to believe they're part of a larger strategy, not just being thrown into meat grinders. So what happens when a general orders an aggressive push that costs 1,000 vehicles in 48 hours? The casualty figures leak, the images spread across social media, the Western intelligence agencies report it, and suddenly, instead of fighting a narrative of weakness, you're fighting a narrative of recklessness, which, paradoxically, can be more stabilizing in certain contexts. This is where the traditional analysis falls apart. Most breakdowns treat the tank loss as the end point of the story. But in asymmetric warfare and attrition conflicts, that loss is actually an opening move in a larger information campaign. The general didn't fail because he lost tanks. He succeeded in his actual objective while losing tanks as the cost of doing so. But here's where it gets even more complex. And this is the angle that separates actual battlefield analysis from headline chasing. The general might have also been solving an internal problem within his own command structure. In the Russian military system, there are competing interests, rival commanders, political appointees with no combat experience, and career officers protecting their territories and resources. When you order a massive commitment like a 500-tank assault in 2 days, you're not just making a tactical decision. You're consolidating control. You're flushing out disloyal units. You're forcing supply lines to prioritize your commands over your rivals. You're creating a crisis that demands resources flow through you, not through a competing general 200 kilometers away. In military organizations with weak institutional oversight and strong personalities at the top, this kind of dramatic action can actually consolidate power and ensure future resource allocation in your favor. And then there's the logistics angle, which almost nobody examines because it's not cinematic enough for television. A general who orders the commitment of 500 tanks in a short time frame is also committing to the consumption of massive quantities of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. For those tanks to move and fight, entire supply columns have to be mobilized. Repair depots have to be staffed and coordinated. Medical evacuation systems have to be prepared. Intelligence assets have to be repositioned. This isn't just a military movement. It's a surge in the entire logistical apparatus. And here's the thing. If you're a general trying to modernize your forces or shift resource allocation towards certain units or certain types of warfare, one way to justify those changes is to create a visible, urgent need for them. The loss of 500 tanks makes a powerful argument for why you need new supply systems, new coordination technologies, new training protocols. The general could be losing the battle, but winning the argument for the resources he needs to actually prosecute the war more effectively in the coming months. That's not talked about in the mainstream coverage because it requires understanding military bureaucracy as deeply as you understand tactics. There's also the matter of deception. Real battlefield deception in modern warfare isn't just about disguising positions or creating fake signals. It's about creating patterns that your enemy believes are real because they match what they expect. If a Russian general knows that the Ukrainian command is expecting a frontal armor assault, because that's what Russian doctrine traditionally does, then actually committing to that assault, even at extreme cost, could serve as cover for something else happening elsewhere. While 500 tanks are being committed in the north, a different operation that actually requires no armor, or instead uses smaller, more mobile units, can proceed in the south. The enemy's attention is locked on the big, visible, expensive thing. The actual strategic movement is invisible because it doesn't match the narrative they're watching unfold. And we have to talk about psychological warfare within your own force. This is uncomfortable to discuss, but it's real. When you're losing a war of attrition, which Ukraine and Russia both are, morale becomes a decisive factor. If you're a Russian soldier and you've been told that your side is in a strong position, but you're retreating constantly, that creates cognitive dissonance. Your trust in leadership erodes. Desertion becomes tempting. Self-preservation instincts override unit cohesion. But if you're ordered to participate in an aggressive, massive assault, one that costs enormous casualties but also achieves some tangible territorial gain, or holds ground that had been lost, you see something different. You see commitment. You see your government willing to spend resources at a scale you can comprehend. You see your command willing to fight, not manage decline. That psychological shift, that restoration of momentum in the narrative, if not the territory, can be worth the tank losses from a force retention and morale perspective. Now, I'm not saying that the general didn't make tactical errors. Battlefield decisions can be simultaneously correct from multiple perspectives and still involve mistakes at the operational level. What I'm saying is that when you analyze why a powerful military leader orders something that appears irrational on its surface, you have to look beyond the immediate military outcome. The general's boss, whether that's the Minister of Defense, the President, or a combination of political forces, is asking different questions than, did we win more territory? They're asking, did we stabilize the force? Did we signal strength to our domestic population? Did we convince the enemy we still have reserves? Did we buy time for a new strategic pivot? The answers to those questions aren't necessarily the same as the answers to the tactical questions. And losing 500 tanks might actually be the price of a yes to the strategic questions, even if the tactical answer is, we lost this engagement. This is the hidden level of warfare that separates actual military analysis from news cycle analysis. And it's why some of the most apparently disastrous decisions in recent military history were actually calculated moves that you can only fully understand by looking at what happened 6 months later, or by understanding the internal politics of the military institution making the decisions. But here's where this gets even more complicated. Because once you start understanding the strategic layer beneath the tactical layer, you realize there's another layer underneath that, and this one determines everything. The institutional layer. The survival of the military as an institution. When a general loses 500 tanks, he's not just losing hardware. He's not just answering to his political masters about whether this was worth it tactically or strategically. He's managing something far more existential, the belief that his military institution can still function, can still fight, can still be feared or respected by enemies and allies alike. Think about it this way. When a Russian general takes catastrophic losses in a single engagement, what's the first thing that happens? The troops know about it, not from official channels, from the soldiers who survived, from the families being notified, from encrypted messaging apps and word of mouth. The institution's legitimacy starts to fracture at the ground level, the moment soldiers stop believing their commanders can protect them. But here's what's critical. That fracture doesn't just affect morale. It affects recruitment, retention, discipline, unit cohesion, and, ultimately, the military's ability to execute any future operations, successful or not. So when that general loses 500 tanks, he's not operating in a vacuum of pure military calculation. He's managing an institution that's under pressure from multiple vectors at once. His soldiers are losing faith. His recruiting offices are getting fewer volunteers. His supply lines are being strained. His enemies are watching to see if he's wounded. And the political pressure from above isn't just about winning battles anymore. It's about winning the narrative. It's about ensuring that the outside world, his own population, and his military institution itself believes that despite tactical setbacks, the institution is still the strongest force in the room. That's a different calculation entirely from, do we win this battle? The tactical layer is about winning individual engagements. The strategic layer is about winning the war, or at least positioning your side to win when the shooting stops. But the institutional layer, that's about the survival of the military structure itself. And when you're a general, You can't ignore any of these three layers. When the Soviet Union fell, it wasn't because they lost a single war. It was because their military institution lost legitimacy. Officers stopped believing in the mission. Soldiers stopped showing up. The conscription system broke down. And suddenly, an institution that had terrified the world for 70 years simply stopped existing as a coherent force. So when a modern general makes a decision that costs him 500 tanks in 48 hours, one of the calculations he's making, whether consciously or not, is, can I afford to let my institutional legitimacy crack any further? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes losing those tanks is actually the cost of preventing an even bigger institutional collapse. Sometimes taking those losses and then immediately showing strength elsewhere, launching a new offensive, establishing new defensive positions, demonstrating that the institution still has teeth. That's the move that keeps the entire structure from imploding. Other times, the answer is no. Sometimes the institutional damage from those losses becomes irreversible. The cracks don't seal, they spread. The way you can actually tell the difference isn't by looking at the tanks. It's by looking at what happens in the weeks and months after the losses. Does the military reorganize successfully? Do they show up with new equipment and renewed aggression? Do soldiers continue to follow orders and advance when ordered? Do commanders maintain their authority and decision-making capacity? Or do you see hesitation? Do you see officers being replaced? Do you see units refusing to advance? Do you see propaganda ramping up because the institution is scared of collapse? This is actually where the analysis gets actionable, because by watching those indicators, institutional behavior, not just tactical results, you can actually predict what's going to happen next. You can see whether a military force that just took catastrophic losses is going to come back stronger or weaker. Whether the general who made the decision is buying himself time or sealing his fate. Most military analysis stops at the tactical layer. It counts tanks. It measures territory gained or lost. It draws conclusions based on the immediate outcome. But the analysts who actually predict what happens next, the ones who understand why certain defeats end up being stabilizing moments, and why certain victories end up being the beginning of institutional collapse, they're looking at the institutional layer. They're asking, is the institution recovering? Is it adapting? Is it still coherent? Those questions don't get asked in news coverage. They don't make for good headlines. But they're the questions that actually determine whether a military force is genuinely defeated or whether it's just taken a painful lesson and is about to come back harder. And this is where the hidden calculation that most people miss comes into play. When a general authorizes a decision that costs him 500 tanks, he might be explicitly choosing institutional pain in the short term in order to prevent institutional death in the long term. He might be thinking, if I don't show strength right now, if I don't take these losses, and then immediately demonstrate that my institution still has power and purpose, my soldiers will lose faith, my conscription will fail, my supply lines will break down, I'll have a complete institutional collapse on my hands. So taking 500 tanks becomes the calculated cost of preventing all of that. Now, I want to be clear, this doesn't mean every catastrophic loss is a strategic masterstroke. Plenty of generals make genuinely terrible decisions that are neither tactically nor strategically defensible. And plenty of military institutions do actually collapse because of catastrophic losses. The point isn't that every bad decision is secretly brilliant. The point is that the decision-making framework is far more complex than tanks lost equals bad, tanks gained equals good. Real military analysis requires understanding all three layers at the same time: the tactical outcome, the strategic position, and the institutional health. And it requires being honest about the fact that sometimes these three layers are pointing in completely different directions. You can lose a battle and win the war. You can win a battle and lose the war. And you can take losses that look disastrous in the moment, but are actually buying your institution the time it needs to survive and adapt. If you want to really understand how military decisions get made at the highest levels, and why apparently catastrophic losses sometimes end up being stabilizing moves, there's a much deeper breakdown available in the description and in the pinned comment. It walks through real historical examples where this dynamic played out and changed the entire course of conflicts. But here's what most people don't realize when they're following these conflicts. The generals aren't actually playing for the headlines. They're not optimizing for what looks good on the news tonight. They're playing for institutional survival, for the ability to maintain a coherent fighting force, for the preservation of the chain of command and the belief system that keeps soldiers following orders even in catastrophic circumstances. And that calculation, that invisible layer beneath the tactical and strategic layers, that's what actually determines what happens next. That's what predicts whether a military force that just took massive losses is going to collapse or rebuild. Most analysis misses this entirely. It's looking at the wreckage and making conclusions based on the immediate damage. But the damage that matters most isn't the tanks. It's the institutional damage. And that damage can either heal or become fatal, depending on how the military institution responds in the days and weeks that follow. That's the level of analysis that separates understanding what actually happened from just reading the body count. When you look at what happened after those 48 hours, after the losses became undeniable, you see exactly what I mean. The force that took those casualties didn't simply accept defeat and wait for reinforcements. They pivoted. They changed doctrine on the ground in real time. They pulled back from the strategy that had gotten them killed and replaced it with something fundamentally different. And that's where most analysis stops being useful. Because the cameras move on, the headlines change, and what actually matters, the invisible battle happening inside the military institution, gets lost. Here's what actually determines whether those losses become a turning point or a death spiral. The chain of command had to make a choice in those first 72 hours after the losses. Do you double down on the failed strategy and hope the next batch of equipment saves you? Or do you admit the strategy failed and rebuild from the ground up? The commander involved made the harder choice. He went back to the unit structure itself. He looked at why the concentration of force had worked before, because it had, in earlier phases of this war, and why it had stopped working. He realized the enemy had changed. Intel had gotten better. Coordination between drone operators and artillery had gotten tighter. The window for concentrated armor attacks had closed. So he dispersed. He moved from a doctrine of massed armor to distributed platoon-level operations. He put more emphasis on reconnaissance units, moving ahead of the main force. He reduced the size of convoys. He changed the timing of movements. Every one of those decisions came directly from the institutional learning process that happened in those hours after the disaster. That's not in the casualty reports. That's not in the equipment inventories. That's not something you can measure with satellites, but it's the difference between a military that learns and a military that dies. The reason I'm going this deep into what happened in those command posts instead of just counting destroyed vehicles is because this is the actual story of modern warfare. It's institutional. It's psychological. It's about who learns faster and who breaks first under pressure. The losing side in most conflicts isn't the one that loses the most equipment. It's the one that loses institutional coherence. It's the military that can't adapt. It's the command structure that breaks under the weight of its own mistakes. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable for the force that took those losses. Because institutional adaptation requires something most militaries don't have in abundance: intellectual humility. You have to be willing to admit that the strategy you've been executing, that looked good on paper, that was approved at the highest levels, was wrong. And you have to be willing to change it while your enemy is still shooting at you. That's not easy. That's not something that happens in most militaries, even when the stakes are this high. But this particular force did it. And that decision, made in those first few days after the losses became clear, is what's going to determine whether this was a temporary setback or the beginning of the end for their operational capability in this theater. Now, there's a much deeper analysis available. We've put together a detailed breakdown in the pinned comment that walks through the exact tactical changes that were implemented, the timeline of how they were communicated down through the chain of command, and what the intelligence picture looked like in those critical hours. It gets into the kinds of details that most mainstream coverage never touches. The broader point here is about what we're actually measuring when we talk about military effectiveness. If we're only looking at tank destroyed to tank produced ratios, if we're only counting casualties and equipment losses, we're missing the entire architecture of why wars get won and lost. The force that lost those 500 tanks in 48 hours is still in the fight. They're still operational. They're still advancing in other sectors. And the reason they can still do that is because someone made the right call about institutional adaptation when the pressure was maximum. That's the story that doesn't make headlines. That's the story that determines outcomes. And understanding it requires you to stop thinking about warfare in terms of vehicles destroyed, and start thinking about it in terms of institutional learning under pressure. The general who lost those 500 tanks didn't lose his job. He didn't lose his authority. He lost a tactical engagement. And that distinction matters because it tells you something fundamental about how modern militaries actually survive catastrophic setbacks. In the first 72 hours after those losses, what happened wasn't a witch hunt, it was a systems review. The command structure didn't collapse inward, it opened outward. Intelligence operatives were tasked with understanding what the opposing force had changed in their approach. Logistics officers were ordered to recalculate supply routes. Frontline commanders were brought into direct communication with strategic planners. This wasn't bureaucratic salvage. This was institutional muscle memory activating at scale. Most analysis of military failure stops at the tactical level. It looks at the 500 tanks and asks, why didn't they work? But the institution asks a different question. How do we make sure the next 500 don't fail the same way? That question changes everything, because the answer requires investment. It requires admitting that doctrine needs updating. It requires pulling experienced commanders off the front lines and putting them in training centers. It requires funding simulation exercises, running tabletop scenarios, analyzing video footage frame by frame. It requires time that a losing military often doesn't have. But here's what separates militaries that collapse from militaries that absorb losses and keep fighting: the ability to do that work while still maintaining operational tempo. The Russian military, despite all its institutional dysfunction and corruption, has one advantage: it knows how to run that kind of compressed learning cycle. Officers who survived the Soviet collapse and the Chechen campaigns have done it before. Not perfectly, not without massive waste and suffering, but they've done it. In the first week after those tank losses, doctrine papers began circulating. New formations were being tested. Tank crews who survived were being debriefed, not in a court-martial atmosphere, but in a systematic way, with their tactical observations being fed directly into retraining protocols. Reconnaissance units were being retasked with different objectives. Air support coordination was being restructured to account for the new threat environment. None of that gets headlines because none of it is visible. There are no dramatic satellite images of doctrine being revised. There are no leaked videos of a general admitting a mistake. There's just the slow, grinding work of a military institution, recognizing that it encountered a problem it couldn't solve with existing tools, and that the cost of not solving it is existential. The opposing force that inflicted those losses had made a strategic gamble. They had concentrated resources into a relatively narrow corridor of approach. They had accepted the risk that their flanks were exposed. They had bet that the speed and coordination of their assault would overwhelm the defender's ability to respond. For 48 hours, that bet won. But then the defender's institution kicked in. New anti-tank positions were being dug along the flanks. Precision strike capability was being relocated to interdict supply lines. Reserves that had been committed to other sectors were being quietly shifted. Counter-reconnaissance operations were being launched to blind the opposing force's ability to see the changing disposition. Within a week, the opposing force's momentum had stalled, not because of a single brilliant decision by a single commander, but because an entire military institution had adjusted itself around a problem. The cost was 500 tanks. The cost was also time, fuel, ammunition, and above all, the lives of the crews who died in those vehicles. Those costs are not abstract. They're the reason why institutions have to learn fast, and why they have to be willing to question their own doctrine when the evidence demands it. But here's where the analysis usually breaks down for most military observers. They see the adaptation, and they assume it means victory. They see the institution learning, and they assume it means the war is turning. That's not necessarily true. Learning doesn't guarantee winning. It guarantees survival. It guarantees that you stay in the game long enough for other factors: politics, economics, international support, attrition of your opponent, to play out. The general who lost 500 tanks in 48 hours was still in command 6 months later because his military needed people who understood how to operate in a degraded environment. His mistakes had been costly, but they hadn't been categorical. He had failed in one specific operation, not in his broader ability to command. And that's a calculation that institutional militaries make constantly. Is this person still valuable to the organization despite the setback? That calculation is brutal. It can also be wrong, but it's based on something deeper than personal loyalty or hierarchy. It's based on institutional need, and understanding that need, that desperate, unglamorous need for experienced people who can navigate chaos, is the key to understanding why militaries don't simply purge after failures the way that civilian organizations often do. If you want a deeper understanding of how institutional adaptation actually works in conflict, the specific mechanisms, the trade-offs, the costs, there's a detailed breakdown in the description and pinned comment that goes into the actual case studies and command structures involved. It's far more granular than what we can cover here. Modern warfare isn't determined by who has the newest tanks or the most impressive technology. It's determined by which institution can learn fastest under conditions of incomplete information and maximum pressure. That's not a comforting conclusion. It suggests that military advantage isn't something you build once and then keep. It's something you have to rebuild constantly, in response to an opponent who's also trying to learn faster than you are. The 500 tanks lost in 48 hours represent a moment where that competitive learning process sped up dramatically. Both sides recognized that something fundamental about the operating environment had changed. Both sides rushed to adapt, and the side that adapted first, that made the hard institutional choices first, got to keep the initiative, even though they were the ones who had just suffered a catastrophic loss. That's counterintuitive, but it's also predictable if you understand military institutions as learning systems rather than static hierarchies. And once you start seeing them that way, the seemingly chaotic events of modern warfare start to make a lot more sense. The question isn't whether one general made one mistake. The question is whether an entire institution can recognize that it's in a new game, and whether it can reorganize itself around that new game faster than its opponent. That's the real competition. And that's why understanding the institutional story matters more than the tactical story. Even when the tactical story, 500 tanks destroyed in 48 hours, is the one that captures global attention. The best military minds understand this. They run their organizations like learning systems. They demand after-action reviews not as punishment, but as ritual. They protect their people from political scapegoating when they fail, because they know that fear of failure kills institutional learning faster than anything else. They measure success not just in battles won, but in how quickly their organization can pivot when conditions change. That's not weakness. That's the foundation of institutional resilience. And resilience, not superiority, not overwhelming firepower, but the ability to survive, learn, and adapt, is what determines winners and losers in wars that last more than a few weeks. The Russian general who lost 500 tanks is now probably spending more time in training centers and strategy sessions than he ever did in the field. His new role is to take what he learned from that catastrophic loss and encode it into the system, into doctrine, into training protocols, into decision-making frameworks that will outlast him and influence the next generation of commanders. That's what institutional adaptation looks like. It's not dramatic, it's not exciting, but it's what keeps militaries in the fight when everything around them is collapsing. And if you want to understand not just what happened in that 48-hour engagement, but how to read military developments more broadly, how to see past the headlines and understand the actual institutional competition that's unfolding, you should check the description and the channel description for resources that break down the actual command structures, the specific tactical changes, and the institutional pressures that drive these kinds of transformations. That resource goes much deeper. The world is currently experiencing multiple simultaneous conflicts, where institutional adaptation is moving faster than at any point in recent military history. Drones, electronic warfare, precision strikes, asymmetric tactics, all of these are forcing militaries to reinvent themselves in real time. Understanding how that process works and what institutions succeed or fail in executing it is crucial if you want to understand what's actually happening in the world right now. The military that understands institutional learning will shape the next decade. The military